we may be more attuned to events that are happening in other countries because of the internet and the like. And I think that's wonderful. That in itself is fantastic. But it may come at the expense of not paying attention to what's happening 5 miles from where you live.
From NCPR, welcome to Northwards. People, ideas, and conversations from and about Northern New York, Vermont, and beyond. I'm Mitch Teich.
Support for the Northwards podcast comes from the J.C. Steiniger and M.E. McDonald Charitable Fund at Adirondack Community Foundation in support of the Adirondack Community Foundation, building stronger Adirondack communities. I love Sheena Easton. And by I love Sheena Easton, I mean I love that one song by Sheena Easton.
You mean Morning Train?
I do. My Baby Takes It.
There was another song, didn't she? She did the theme song for the James Bond movie For Your Eyes Only.
And did it go, My baby takes the morning train?
It did not.
Oh.
She also did Strut.
I don't know that one.
You don't know Strut by Sheena Easton?
Mitch, every single episode of this show cannot be every single episode of this show cannot be you come into the studio and make me play 2 minutes of a song.
But you've been in radio for a long time. You played music. You were, I guess you worked. Well, what are the various genres of music that you just country?
Well, my professional career, just country. When I was in college, I had It
was probably not an 80s pop.
It was not an 80s
show.
pop show. I did play occasionally some 80s pop, but it was mostly what was in rotation for like indie rock for that era, which was 2008 until 2010. And then other than that, I had a vinyl show where I would play one record in full. I did work at an oldie station, PAC 98.7, super hits of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. However, that was just my office. Like that
was just your office?
Yes. So I know that sounds weird.
You're actually a nuclear engineer.
The way the radio station was set up is that there were 3 radio stations in one building.
Right.
So there was the lobby, if you can call it a lobby. There was the first room that you came into. And then,
yes, I'm familiar with those stations.
And there was the oldie station, which was my office. There was the pop station, which was my boss's office. And then there was the country station, which was another guy's office and then sort of became my office. Anyway, yeah. So the only professional DJ music that I've played, professional DJ music.
the only music that you have spun as a professional radio disc jockey
is country, except for when I've been here and I've filled in on other shows, but that doesn't really count. So yeah, I know a lot of Kenny Chesney songs. Do you want to hear about all those?
No, that's all right.
Okay, cool. Let's move on.
But yeah, it's funny because, in all these conversations we've had about our lives in radio, for some reason I was imagining that you had it wasn't necessarily that you had gone from station to station, but just knowing how small town stations often change formats so frequently.
Yeah.
I guess I had imagined that there were times where you had to go from one day you're a country DJ and the next day you're doing 80s music. And then 6 months later, when the 80s music didn't work out, you're doing classic country.
Nope. That was not me. I was pretty much one format at a time, except for when my boss was on vacation, in which case I would be pulling double duty and hosting the country morning show and the pop morning show at the same time through a series of radio station tricks we called pre-recording. And
I was just imagining the songs were different lengths, so you'd get done playing one and walk into the studio next door God. I guess I still have 35 seconds left on this Kenny G song.
It was such a pain in the butt to do it. And it was one of those situations where it was just like, well, the work's got to get done, so I guess I'll do it. But oftentimes the same luxury was not afforded to me. But I wasn't the boss, so, whatever.
Interesting. Well, so I my first paid job in radio was overnights on 96.5 FM in
96.5
96.5 WMT FM. They were called 96.5, and they stipulated that there was like the one with a slash and the two, it's 3:45 a.m. You're listening to 96.5 WMT.
What was your favorite song to intro?
What was my favorite song to intro?
Yeah.
God, I don't know. It was the middle of the night. My favorite song to intro was whatever I could get into really quick, so that I could go back to trying not to nod off.
So it was live,
It was live, yeah,
not
yeah.
pre-recorded.
No, we had live. The way they did the overnights at 96.5 FM in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, was they had a different overnight jock every night, so
Oh.
they didn't have to pay anybody benefits for working overnight, nor did they have to pay us very much.
So wait, so did you have throughout the week? Did you have a normal shift that you were keeping, and then one night you also had overnights?
No, I just did one overnight a week.
Oh, I see.
It was on Thursday night from 11 p.m. to 5:30 a.m.
And you made $25 a day.
Something. It was probably. I think it was like $5.50 or $6 an hour. So yeah, it was maybe $30.
Was it worth it?
Well, it got me into radio.
Well, sure.
And actually led to my first full-time job, not at 96.5, but the program director at 96.5, his brother-in-law was a former Cedar Rapids area morning show host who had moved with his wife to a small town about 2.5 hours north of Cedar Rapids because she had gotten a job in the development office of the little liberal arts college that was up there.
Oh, cool.
And he had become the morning guy on the local radio station there and knew they were looking for a news director.
Cool.
And they recruited me through that, which is how I ended up here today.
Can you still sing the jingle for 96.5?
I don't remember that it was an adult contemporary station, so there was not really a jingle.
We had a couple of jingles for Q Country, and as far as I remember, a couple jingles for, all the stations had a couple of different jingles.
Well, I can remember. So the station that I ended up going to full time after that, it was actually an AM FM station. The AM station was Music of Your Life, 1240 KDEC. But the FM station was also a 0.5. It was 100.5. But for some reason, they identified themselves as, or we identified ourselves as Music 101.
But you weren't a 101.
No, we were 100. I think it was because it was a college town. So they thought, hey, Music 101, it's like a college class.
If I knew that at the time, I would have sued.
Well, and the only part of the jingle I remember was the sounder that they played before we gave a weather forecast. So, you'd come out of a commercial and you'd hear Music 101 weather.
Every weather report on every radio station ever has had that like the.
Well, it gets you really excited about it being partly cloudy and 64. Chance of showers.
It's the so when your radio station is running on automation, like many do these days, you have to assign a certain file name so that it will play the same way every single time. When I was at Q Country SFM Impact 98.7, the weather file that we pre-recorded was called WX, and to this day, when I write my weather report and I say that
standard weather abbreviation,
is it okay? That's still what I use to this day. It's just WX forever and all time.
It's like prescription, like prescriptions are RX. Yeah. Weather is WX. I don't know why.
Who are we talking to today?
We're talking to Neil Forkey, who is a professor of Canadian Studies at St. Lawrence University and a historian who has studied the environmental activism movement on both sides of the border. For people who are not listening in our local area, we are located not far from the Canadian border.
That's true.
In what's called the St. Lawrence Valley, so named because of the St. Lawrence River that runs right through our part of the world, with Ontario and a little further up, Quebec on the other side, the Canadian side of the border, and New York State on our side. And in the 60s and 70s and on into the 80s and even early 90s, there was a series of kind of environmental controversies and crises that led to a lot of grassroots activism on both sides of the border. Some stories that I had known a little about. I lived here for a couple of years in the 90s, and I've been back for almost 7 years now. You grew up in this area, and you're probably somewhat familiar familiar with some of these controversies,
Yeah.
but I think one of the most interesting parts of the story to me is the idea that this is a relatively conservative part of New York State,
Sure is.
certainly, and,
Yeah.
and of the country. But people sort of from all political stripes work together in a lot of these cases to preserve the way of life that existed in this area, and still to some degree, the rural way of life that exists in this area. The book is just out. It's called Defending a Borderland, and we reached Neil Forkey in Montreal. Thanks so much for taking some time.
It's my pleasure, Mitch.
One of the points that you make pretty constantly through this book is that for years before the 60s and 70s, for maybe generations, the North Country of New York was a pretty conservative Republican place, and obviously, the region has its conservatism still today, but it's a bit more of a mixed bag. What was it that laid the foundation for the environmental activism that you write about?
Well, I think one of the threads that comes through in my research is that not only was there, as you point out, a conservative streak that runs through a lot of the North Country politics in most of the 20th century, early 20th century, but that was also fused with a real sense of place, of protecting both the natural environment, a close connection, of course, with the Adirondacks, as well as with the St. Lawrence Valley, the river itself, and a certain sense that there are, well, certainly more than one New York, and that the North Country considered itself to be an important region unto itself, even within New York politics. So I won't say there was suspicion towards decisions made from Albany or influences coming out of New York City, let's say. I wouldn't go that far. But there was certainly a sense that the North Country people knew what was best for them. And if you fuse that with the idea or the migration in the 1960s, early 1970s of homesteaders back to the land people, it becomes even more acute and linked to other national issues, or I should say, national moods that again feed into this idea of protecting the local communities.
And by local communities, we're really talking about a local way of life.
Absolutely. One of the trends in American and Canadian historiography to some extent is to point out that there was a dramatic shift in the 1960s, early 1970s, away from what we would consider to be conservation politics, that is to say, wise use of natural resources. People were still interested in those things, but they also became very well versed about environmental issues. This has its roots in America with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, 1962. In a more sort of general way, in Canadian literature, there was a book that it gets attention now and again called The Last of the Curlews by Fred Wadsworth, written in 1954, which tells the story of the extinction of a certain bird, the Eskimo curlew. All of these things, alongside people's interest in what went into their food, the air they breathed. Ralph Nader was telling people to question the cars they drove. Consumers in general were becoming more aware of the things that were available to them with their purchasing dollars, and they wanted to know how these things affected them. So there was, I would say, a greater awareness of things that went into the daily life. Let's put it that way.
Well, and it struck me that the idea of the homesteading movement and the back to the landers who were beginning to populate the North Country, many of these people came to the region specifically to kind of get away from the encroachment of the sorts of industrialized problems they ended up fighting against.
Absolutely. It was a deliberate move to be either living a more simple life or to challenge their own selves about, can I live a life that is one that is departing from this industrial, somewhat over-consumer based society. And we find that on the Canadian side too, but far more in my own research in the case studies that I'm looking at here in this book.
Well, and so speaking of Canada, what was life like? What was the population like along the St. Lawrence River at sort of the dawn of this era, the 60s and early 70s, in comparison to the places that we see today on the Canadian side?
Well, the book takes up basically Western Quebec and Eastern Ontario all the way out to about Kingston. So then, as now, these are not enormously populated areas. You take away Montreal, Ottawa, and Kingston to some extent. Those are certainly large centers. But the areas in between all that hug along the north shore of the St. Lawrence are much less populated. They were important in terms of producing very able politicians. I'm talking on the Canadian side, people who went on to do big things and do important things, say at the local and the provincial levels of politics, but their numbers never really counted among the big power centers in Canada. And in Canada, representation is based on population. So cities have more weight in sort of determining the political agenda wherever one might be.
Something that really struck me as I read about the various issues that brought the environmental activism community together, I guess it was the notion that many of the changes that were being sought, whether it was about building new power lines or nuclear plants or allowing year-round access to the St. Lawrence Seaway, these were primarily for the benefit of other places with a lot more people and a lot more means. So how was it that these smaller groups that you write about were able to meet with some success for having, sort of less means at their disposal?
That's a good point. And if we take, for example, the incinerator issue, this is certainly an issue that affected both sides of the river. And this was also at a time when the acid rain issue, we're talking the mid to late 80s, early 90s, when the acid rain issue between the two countries was really in the headlines. That was one way of sort of marshaling attention on both sides of the border to this issue of the air that people breathed. As one of the movers and shakers in this book that I cite, Bill Borger had said, the wind knows no boundary. It passes between both countries rather easily. There was also, if you take the late 80s, early 90s, there was an attempt by the Strategic Air Command, the Air Force, to fly training runs of bomber B-52s and F-111 fighter bombers over the North Country. And on one hand, this was accepted as a matter of national security by some, but others said, well, wait a minute. Normally, where these test flights occur are where people really live in sparse populations, and there's no chance of really damaging people's hearing, or God forbid, an air crash, something like that. And so, with those sorts of things in play, the local group that I write about, called COLAF, the Coalition on Low Altitude Flights, they really sort of impressed upon people that these were important points of this matter. The other thing that certainly helped on the New York side was the 1970 Environmental Protection Act, which empowered ordinary people with the ability to bring, or at least question, big projects that were spearheaded by the federal government. There had to be some sort of environmental review. And with the Air Force, this became a prime issue. So there was that path as well. Citizens became very adept at using legislative and, if possible, if needed, the legal processes that would bring about a successful result.
You mentioned COLEF, and I think one of the things that really grabbed me as I was reading this book is how good the community was at coming up with acronyms. There's some amazing names, between
really
UPSAT and PANDA and COLEF. It's, it's a lot of alphabet soup, but some really like long-lasting names.
Absolutely, very clever. My favorite is found on the Canadian side. There was a group that was committed to preventing, or at least modifying, a Parks Canada plan to expand the St. Lawrence Islands Park. and they were called the Thousand Islands Area Residents Association, and their acronym was TIARA. So yeah, you're absolutely right. That was part of the fun of putting these groups together and really studying them.
Well, and in a serious way, when they were creating, I'm sure it helped to have a name that easily rolled off the tongue that people would remember.
Absolutely. Well, the best example of that is Save the River. There's a story there to be told, but since we're speaking about acronyms and choice of names, the originator for Save the River wanted to put the verb first. Tell people what you want to do. You want to save something. The river was obvious enough, but keep it short, keep it memorable, and keep it active.
We're of course having this conversation in 2026, and there's a lot of activity in the United States surrounding the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. 50 years ago, 1976, a lot of the same was going on, but there was also a really seminal moment in the environmental history of this region. What can you tell us about the Slick of 76 for people who aren't familiar with that chapter?
Well, your journalists at NCPR have been covering this and its anniversaries pretty faithfully and very well. But at Mason's Point, on June 23rd, 1976, a barge that was carrying crude oil, heavy crude oil, twice hit the shallow shoals and ruptured. And it spilled 300,000 gallons of crude oil into the river around Alex Bay. The current brought it as far east as Messina.
Within a day, right? I mean,
within a day or at least 48 hours, yeah. But it cost $8 million to clean up, and it lasted over 120 days. It ruined the tourist trade for people on the river, so campgrounds, marinas all sort of suffered. It was also the Summer Olympics in Montreal, so a lot of local people had planned on a lot of traffic coming through the region, maybe with people en route to the Olympics that would stay in the North Country. That was a trigger, and I point this out in the book. This was a living, breathing example of why local people, needed to take care of their own environment as they saw it. And this Slick of 76 led to even more intense interest in the river itself. And by 1978, the Army Corps of Engineers and the St. Lawrence Seaway Corporation were attempting, at least through tests, to see if year-round winter navigation was feasible. And there is really where Save the River gets its start. In other words, the trigger is the Slick, but the winter navigation issue was the thing that really mobilized people in a more long-term sort of way.
And Save the River is maybe the one organization that has some star power behind it.
Absolutely. As it turns out, it was Abbie Hoffman, who was on the run, went, as they say, underground in the mid-1970s, resurfaced in the area at Grindstone Island under an assumed name. The name was Barry Freed. He had some minor plastic surgery done, and he sort of passed himself off locally as a TV producer who summered in the region. And it was around that time that both of these occurrences that we've just spoken about happened. And as I point out in the book, and I've told this story to other people, Hoffman got tired of being not busy and non-active, and he spearheaded this movement again under an assumed name, and having to channel a lot of his energy into not being Abbie Hoffman, but being this assumed persona named Barry Freed. And he really got things done. He mobilized people. He and his partner, Joanna Lawrenson, whose family had deep ties in the region and had been on the island for many, many years, sort of came up with this, the logo of Save the River, the idea for really affecting the political process. So you had, interesting political bedfellows. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan was up here for Senate hearings and investigating this. The state of New York didn't like this idea because it potentially would be bearing the brunt of any, say, oil spills Imagine an oil spill of that magnitude in the wintertime, the cleanup, how terrible that would be. So you had Hugh Carey on board. So you had really interesting cross currents of politics that ranged from the radical types of Hoffman to the very mainstream of the New York congressional and senatorial ends.
Well, and the radical style of Hoffman. At the same time, I think you're right that he kind of modified his style a little bit for specifically for this fight.
Right.
Sort of being able to read the zeitgeist of the North Country and the people he was trying to get behind him. He took a much less sort of outwardly radical approach.
And he had to be, as people have pointed out, he was not going to find many other quote unquote radicals within a 500-mile radius to support his ideas that, in American history, we know him best for. 1968 Chicago Convention and so on. So most certainly he had to adapt and limit or hold back his enthusiasm to act the way in which the Abbie Hoffman we know in American history books once acted.
In a lot of ways, the story of this book and the episodes that you write about on both sides of the border seem to be a lot of examples of strange bedfellows, people who we wouldn't normally think of working together, sort of joining forces for the sake of either NIMBYism or fighting against the NIMBYism of other parts of the countries.
Right. And I think this is where environmental historians have a lot to offer because they certainly look at the social landscape, the environmental problems or threats to the environment, and if they're asking the right questions, they can sometimes find really interesting pairings of peoples, as you say, who normally would think of themselves as politically aligned or even having common ideas, but when it does come to their own neighborhoods, their own communities, well, it can be a different story. And I frame a lot of this around this phrase, as you pointed out, NIMBYism, not in my backyard. But I don't want to misrepresent the term nor the people. They really were thinking in terms of their immediate communities, their backyards. That is true. But they also applied a kind of shorthand, which was to say, we don't think this should be in anybody's backyard. These are things that are going to harm not only the environment, our water, our air, our land, but people, just by being exposed to these threats.
Right, the story of the power lines coming from Hydro Quebec goes all the way up to northern Quebec, and
Yeah.
and the indigenous communities that would be impacted
Absolutely.
just as strongly as the Akwesasne Mohawks.
Absolutely. And there's a good way to really point out the length and breadth of this study, but also the way in which local people thought well beyond their immediate communities. So to sort of provide some context, New York City in the late 60s, early 70s was prone to power shortages. And it was about this time that the province of Quebec was really developing James Bay and the power that was being produced from the north there. And in 1973, the province of Quebec and the state of New York signed an agreement for sharing power. But in order for that to happen, a very elaborate power grid had to be constructed. And these were heavy duty, very tall, very high powered, what were called 765 kV lines. And as you point out, it would bring power from James Bay all the way to New York City. And we get back to an earlier theme. Local people saw absolutely positively no benefit for themselves in this because these very high current would cross over farmers' fields. Dairy farmers wondered what would this do to not only their own livelihoods, but the cows that they were grazing. The science was really not very solid, as I saw it in the 1970s, to either dismiss this issue as being hysterical or otherwise. So there was some real concerns that people had about health, their own plus their own livelihoods. And it does get back to the idea of a rural way of life that they also saw being threatened. But what is interesting in the case of the 765 power lines is that the Akwesasne Mohawk also participated in these demonstrations because again, these high-powered pylons cut through their territory or very, very close to it. It was also in the mid 1970s really an upsurge of land claims and other issues that were germane to Akwesasne, not to mention their own health. After the St. Lawrence Seaway went in and more industries located along the river, particularly along Akwesasne, both poisonings of the water and the air were soon discovered. And Mohawks are still without long-term solutions to any of these problems. So a lot of those politics and those issues cut through the book as well. But in Akwesasne notes and in the words of other peoples who were in the press and offering their opinions at the time, they were pointing to the fact that the James Bay Cree were suffering other effects, mercury poisoning and the like, and the threat of inundation of their traditional hunting grounds. So there was most certainly a common cause well up into northern Quebec from people here in the St. Lawrence Valley.
Yeah. Someone reading about this era today might well ask how the organizing for this environmental activism took place in the absence of the tools we have today. You know, the social media and the immediacy of cell phones and even email. How did these groups like Upset and Panda and Tiara, how did they come together and get their work done?
This is something I do write about in the book, and a colleague of mine from St. Lawrence University, our archivist, Paul Haggett, pointed this out one day while I was researching. And he said, you really want to think deeply about this. This is well before Twitter, X, before the internet was ever invented. I won't say it's simple, but it's a lot easier now to join like-minded people across the globe, never mind just down the street from you. And it was a matter of being able to meet in person, sometimes very informally, bumping into someone and mentioning, have you heard about such and such plan for this area? This is something I really admire about this generation. And I don't have really the answer you're looking for, except to say that they were accustomed to really paying attention and looking out for their neighbors in a way that we may not enjoy so much today. I think there's a certain anonymity in the media, the electronic media that we now rely on, myself included, that puts us at a distance from people and being able to share ideas and to debate things. I don't want to give you the impression for one moment that everybody was in total agreement about the strategies that should be employed to address whatever the environmental threat may have been. But they managed to get things done by sitting down and talking and organizing and canvassing and getting the word out. And even though they weren't terribly media savvy by our standards, they did manage to get the local media and sometimes national media to really pay attention to these issues.
So if we look around the region along the border here today, what do you think is the legacy of the era that you write about in this book?
Well, I talk about this in the conclusion. I think one of the best ways of illustrating the longevity of this activist spirit or this idea of protecting the region is to look at the various land trusts, not only on the New York side, where you've got at least two that I can think of, but also on the Canadian side. You've got the Frontenac Arch Biosphere. You've got the Thousand Islands Land Trust, the St. Lawrence Land Trust. All of those land trusts are important foundations for an organization called the Algonquin to Adirondacks Collaborative, the A2A, which tries to increase biodiversity, provide a terrestrial sort of bridge for migrating animals across the river. Some of that occurs naturally during winter when you have the ice, but this is an idea that tries to create a more contiguous or continuous land bridge, terrestrial bridge. You might also look very locally at groups like the Grass River Heritage, which tries to really play up the importance of local rivers.
Do you think is there something vital at this point in time about understanding the environmental activists who came before?
Well, I think as I said, it may help us to realize that some of these debates, when people were in the midst of them, really seemed insurmountable. I mean, you take, for example, in Brockville and Prescott, there was a very strong movement to try to locate at least one large um, energy producing site, likely a nuclear power plant. And citizens there, again, really hadn't thought of themselves as being activists of any kind. But in that case, people from a number of different backgrounds, the medical fields, science teachers in high schools, mathematicians in high schools, people who paid attention to the bigger environmental issues globally. They recognized that in their own backyards, they could also see these threats to their way of life at work, not just their way of life, but their own health. And in the case of Prescott and Brockville, there was the background sort of reevaluation of the of Ontario Hydro about the energy needs of that part of the province. In other words, they scaled back the projections of how much energy would be needed, say in 20 or even 30 years. But the thing that happened in the midst of all of this was the accident at 3 Mile Island in March of 1979. So, sort of happening off stage was this living, breathing examples that indeed these sorts of accidents are not isolated. They could happen anywhere.
Well, and the idea that what happens in the North Country is not happening in a vacuum.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think that's also part of it. We were talking a little while ago about, how does this activism emerge? How does it blossom? How do the debates sort of play out? You have to recognize these were peoples that really paid attention to the nightly news, and they read the newspaper, and they were privy to other big environmental news that was going on all over the world, but particularly during a period, again, the environmental movement was really at its peak in the later 60s, early 1970s, and into the 80s for different reasons. And local people started to recognize that, again, these events, these phenomena were not happening in a vacuum.
This was a time when people had longer attention spans.
These conversations continued around dinner tables. They continued at public events. I don't know whether or not people were any more active in their communities, say at city council meetings or the like. It's hard for me to really judge that, but I think people paid attention to the daily things that were happening around them, perhaps more than we realize. We may be more attuned to events that are happening in other countries because of the internet and the like, and I think that's wonderful. That in itself is fantastic, but it may come at the expense of not paying attention to what's happening 5 miles from where you live.
Neil Forkey, it's really interesting stuff, and I'm grateful for the chance to talk with you about it and have you share your insights.
No, it was my pleasure, Mitch. Thank you very much for asking.
Neil Forkey teaches at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York, and is author of the new book, Defending a Borderland, published by the University of Massachusetts Press. It's all about the environmental activism movement on both the U.S. and Canadian side of the border in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and on into the 90s. We reached him at his home office in Montreal. Ethan Chancey, one of the really interesting things that I found out in reading this book was a little something about My predecessor in this job, not as host of Northwards, but my
As the
predecessor
station.
as the station manager
Yeah.
at North Country Public Radio, Ellen Rocco, who,
Yeah.
was station manager for 35 years. 35 years? Yeah, I think 35.
Sounds about right.
34, 35 years before I took over the job. But before that, she was one of the people who was part of the Back to the Land movement, the homesteader movement, who moved up to the North Country in the 70s, and she was actually the de facto spokesperson for one of these environmental organizations that was fighting against some of the things like power lines coming through the region. And NCPR, as we heard in the interview, was sort of seen as a clearinghouse for news about what was going on in the region, as it still is today. But it was interesting to get a little glimpse into this place and some of the people that have long been a part of our radio history here, back before we knew them.
Yeah.
You and I knew them.
Yeah,
Other people knew
that's
them.
really interesting to learn about Ellen, and it's making me think about the hidden lives that we have before we come into the orbit of other people. The one that I'm thinking about for me, that would probably be a surprise to people, is that I worked for the federal government on a study about occupational noise in a factory setting for about a year. I did. It was
What did you do?
So I was I was like a volunteer liaison. It was through the University of Washington out of Seattle. So it was a fully remote job, and I would go on site to Alcoa. The volunteers all wore these monitors into earplugs that they would wear around the factory floor every single day. And then at the end of the shift, they would drop it into a reader that would rip all of the data so they could see how much noise these volunteers were being exposed to. And I would troubleshoot their equipment. I would, talk to them about any problems that they were having. And then, they would get like these gift cards as incentives and stuff. And I was just sort of like the go-between between them and the university. Yeah.
But you worked for the federal government.
Yeah. It was a federal study.
So this was like through the Occupational Safety Health
Something like
Administration
that.
or something,
Yeah.
but
Yep.
it was being administered by...
Yeah, and it was kind of a weird, like every other job I think I've ever had. It was a weird entrance into it. Just like I knew somebody who was doing the study as a graduate student. He was going to be moving on to a different state, so he asked me if I would be interested, and I was like, "Well, yeah, I'm interested in the money. I will take the money for no. I was like, this does appeal to my interest because I'm a person who is exposed to noise all of the time, and I would like to better know how it's being tracked and improved, how hearing protection is being improved. How
long ago was this?
That was it was my last year at Yes FM, so that was 9 years ago, I guess, was when I stopped doing it. Yeah, I did it for just about a year. What is the strange job or hidden thing about you that would surprise people?
So earlier in this episode, I talked about my first paid job in radio.
Yeah.
It was not, now that I think of it, not really my first paid job in radio. My first paid job in radio was at another adult contemporary station, 94.7 W Light FM, Light Rock, Less Talk in Washington, D.C., and I was the receptionist for about a month.
And then you decided it wasn't for you?
Then I decided that this was a good reason for me to go back to college. So actually, the moment I made that decision was when I was filling in for somebody who was on maternity leave.
That's exactly how I started. Well, not how I started, but I had a job like that here before I was full-time. Whatever, Go ahead.
Anyway, so I was filling in for somebody on maternity leave, and with all due respect to whoever that person was, there was one of the DJs that came up to me after about 2 weeks and said, you are the best receptionist we ever had. And and that is really, it was no disrespect to the work of a receptionist at a radio station.
It's not an easy job.
No, it is not. It is not an easy job. But I also knew that was not my aspiration.
Right.
And at that point, I already knew I wanted to go into radio, but I sort of knew that to get from this job as a temporary receptionist to someone who was working in the news department someplace, I would actually need to go back to school.
I was so dissatisfied with my career path at that radio station that just my career path with radio in general, because a lot of commercial radio, this might not be a surprise to a lot of people, doesn't pay very well.
Music 101 weather.
I made 30 cents for that weather report. I thought about, just as a means of getting out of radio, I thought about going back to school. And my friend, who's a professor, actually talked me out of it. He was like, you don't need a degree to do what you want to do. You should just go do it. And I didn't do it.
Sheena Easton, take us out.
Northwards is an NCPR podcast production. The show is written, produced, and edited by Mitch Tyke with digital production supervision by me. I'm Ethan Shanty. Bill Hanel is our Director of Digital Services. Anna Williams-Bergen handles our social media. And our theme music is by the Wickmore Jazz Trio of Plattsburgh. Learn more about this show and make a donation in support of it and everything else we do at NCPR when you head to ncpr.org/northwards. This is NCPR North Country Public Radio.